The Galactic Council chamber on Valanthos Prime was the most beautiful room in the known universe. Giant crystal pillars rose from the floor to the ceiling, each one glowing with soft blue light. The walls were made of living stone that changed color with the mood of the room. Floating platforms carried diplomats from 100 different worlds, their voices mixing into a constant hum of alien languages. Princess Selara sat on her throne and watched the proceedings with bored silver eyes. She had attended these meetings since she was a child, and they were always the same. Representatives argued about trade routes and border disputes. Generals demanded more ships and more soldiers. Nothing ever changed, but today was different. Today, the council had invited a human. Selara had studied humans in her lessons. They were a young species from a small blue planet on the edge of the galaxy. They lived short lives, barely a century if they were lucky. Their bodies were fragile, with soft skin that tore easily and bones that shattered under pressure. They could not see in the dark or hear sounds beyond a narrow range. By every measure, they were one of the weakest intelligent species ever discovered, and yet they had spread across dozens of star systems in just a few hundred years. They had survived wars that should have destroyed them. They had built ships that crossed the void between stars, even though their bodies were never meant for space. The Volanthi had ignored them for a long time. Why bother with such primitive creatures? But now the Kreth Dominion was coming, and the Kreth did not care about old alliances or ancient treaties. They wanted conquest, and they had the power to take it. Desperation made strange allies. The chamber doors opened, and Selara did not bother to look. She expected some nervous diplomat in fancy clothes, clutching documents and sweating under the gaze of superior beings. She expected weakness. The sound of boots on marble made her glance up. A human male walked into the chamber. He wore no ceremonial robes, no shimmering cape, no floating crown. He was dressed in simple green fabric that covered his body from neck to ankle. Heavy black boots struck the floor with each step. His face was calm, and his eyes moved slowly across the room, taking in every detail. Selara found herself leaning forward on her throne. The human was not tall. He stood shorter than most of the species in the room. His skin was a warm brown color, marked with pale lines that she realized were scars. His hair was cut very short, almost to the skin. His hands hung loose at his sides, but there was something about the way he held them that suggested they could move very fast if needed. He walked to the center of the chamber and stopped. He did not bow. He did not kneel. He simply stood there and waited. The council fell silent. Ambassador Dorvan was the first to speak. He was a massive creature with 4 arms and skin like gray armor. His people had been warriors for 10,000 years, and they looked down on everyone who was not. "You are the human representative?" Dorvan asked. His voice echoed through the chamber like thunder. "Sergeant Jake Callahan," the human said. "United Earth Marine Corps. A soldier?" Dorvan laughed. "They sent us a soldier instead of a diplomat?" "They sent what they had," Jake said. His voice was steady and low. "I was available." Whispers spread through the chamber. Selara heard the words insult and primitive repeated by several diplomats. She should have felt the same way. Instead, she felt curious. "Tell me, human," Dorvan continued, "what can your species offer this alliance? You are small and weak. Your ships are slow. Your weapons are crude. Why should we accept your help?" Jake looked at the ambassador for a long moment. Then he looked around the room, meeting the eyes of every species watching him. Finally, his gaze found Selara on her throne. She felt a strange shock run through her body. No one looked at royalty so directly. "We can offer what we have always offered," Jake said. "We can fight? Fight?" Dorvan laughed again. "Your bones break like dry wood. Your bodies cannot heal themselves. You die from wounds that would barely slow a Volante child. That's true, Jake agreed. We break easy. We die easy. But we keep coming. The laughter in the chamber faded. My grandfather fought in a war on Earth, Jake continued. He was shot 3 times on a beach called Normandy. He crawled through the sand with his legs not working, and he kept firing his weapon until his people reached the cliffs above. He lived another 60 years after that. Saylara realized she had risen from her throne. She did not remember standing. My mother served on a ship called the Frontier, Jake said. When the reactor failed, she stayed behind to seal the breach. She saved 400 people. She knew she was going to die, and she did it anyway. The chamber was completely silent now. That's what humans do, Jake said. We're not the strongest. We're not the fastest. We don't live the longest. But we don't give up. Not when we're hurt. Not when we're scared. Not when everyone tells us we've already lost. He looked at Dorvan with eyes that held no fear. You want to know what we can offer? We can offer everything we have. Every soldier, every ship, every drop of blood in our bodies. And when we're broken and bleeding, we'll find a way to keep fighting. Saylara's hearts were pounding. She had met warriors from a dozen species. She had studied generals who had won 1,000 battles. But she had never heard anyone speak like this. The human was not bragging. He was not threatening. He was simply telling the truth as he understood it. Dorvan stared at Jake for a long time. Then he turned to the council and spoke in a cold voice. Pretty words from a fragile creature. I propose a test. Let the human prove his worth in combat. If he survives, we will consider his offer. If he falls, we will know that his species has nothing to give us. Jake nodded slowly. Name the time and place. Saylara stepped down from her platform before she could stop herself. Her advisors called out to her, but she ignored them. She walked across the chamber until she stood before the human soldier. He looked up at her. He was not afraid. He was not impressed. He simply waited. You understand what you have agreed to? She asked. Her voice was soft, meant only for him. I understand, Jake said. The combat trials are brutal. Many warriors have died in them. Then I'll try not to die. Saylara felt something she had not felt in many years. She did not know what to call it yet, but it made her want to see this human again. Good luck, Sergeant Callahan, she said. Jake nodded once. Then he turned and walked out of the chamber, his boots echoing on the marble floor. Saylara watched him go. She did not return to her throne for a very long time. The arena was older than human civilization. It had been carved from a single mountain thousands of years ago, its walls polished smooth by the hands of countless workers. Seats rose in great circles around the fighting pit, enough to hold 50,000 spectators. Today, every seat was filled. Jake stood at the edge of the pit and looked down. The floor was made of black sand that would absorb blood without staining. The walls were too high to climb. There was no way out except through victory or death. He had faced difficult situations before. He had fought in the trenches of Titan Colony, where the air was poison and the enemy came in waves that never stopped. He had survived the orbital siege of New Manila, floating in the wreckage of his ship for 3 days before rescue arrived. He had buried friends and watched cities burn, but he had never fought an alien warrior in front of 50,000 witnesses. Ambassador Dorvan entered from the opposite side of the arena. He was even larger than Jake remembered, standing nearly 8 feet tall, with arms as thick as tree trunks. His gray armor skin gleamed under the lights. He carried no weapon because he did not need one. His 4 hands could crush stone. The crowd roared with approval. Jake walked down the steps into the pit. He wore the same simple clothes he had worn to the council meeting. He had refused the ceremonial armor the Volante offered. It would only slow him down. Princess Saylara watched from the royal balcony. She had not slept well since the council meeting. Her advisors told her the human would die quickly, and the matter would be forgotten. They told her not to worry. She could not stop worrying. The announcer spoke in a booming voice that filled the arena. He explained the rules of the combat trial. The fight would continue until one warrior surrendered or could no longer stand. Weapons were forbidden. Everything else was permitted. Jake listened carefully. Then he looked up at the royal balcony and found Saylara's silver eyes. He nodded once, very slightly. She felt her heart skip. The signal sounded, and Dorvan charged. The ambassador moved faster than his size suggested. He crossed the arena in seconds, all four arms reaching for Jake with fingers that could tear through metal. The crowd screamed with excitement. This would be over quickly. Jake was not there. He moved at the last moment, stepping to the side with a motion so smooth it looked almost lazy. Dorvan's hands grabbed empty air. The ambassador stumbled, surprised by his own momentum. Jake did not attack. He simply watched, his feet light on the black sand. Dorvan turned and charged again. This time he was more careful, more controlled. He swung his upper arms in wide arcs, while his lower arms reached low, trying to trap Jake between them. Again, Jake slipped away. He moved like water around a stone, always flowing to the place where Dorvan was not. He did not run. He did not show fear. He simply refused to be where the ambassador expected him to be. The crowd grew quiet. This was not what they had expected. Saylara leaned forward on her balcony. She had watched hundreds of combat trials. She knew what victory looked like, and she knew what death looked like. She had never seen anything like this. The human was reading Dorvan. Every attack taught him something new about how the ambassador moved, how he thought, how he reacted to frustration. Jake was learning his enemy while the enemy exhausted himself. Dorvan roared with anger and attacked with all his strength. His blows came faster and harder, tearing through the air with enough force to shatter bone. Any one of them would kill a human instantly. None of them landed. Minutes passed. Dorvan's breathing grew heavy. His movements became slower, less precise. He had never fought an opponent who refused to stand still. "Fight me!" Dorvan screamed. "Stop running and fight." Jake stopped moving. He stood in the center of the arena and waited. Dorvan hesitated. This had to be a trick. The human could not possibly want to face him directly, but the crowd was watching. Dorvan's honor demanded that he accept the challenge. He rushed forward with all four arms raised. Jake moved. It happened so fast that most of the spectators did not understand what they saw. Jake stepped inside Dorvan's reach, where the long arms could not find him. His hand struck 3 times in rapid succession, hitting points on the ambassador's body that Saylara did not recognize. Pressure points, she realized. Nerve clusters. Places where even armor skin could not protect the flesh beneath. Dorvan's legs stopped working. He fell forward, crashing into the black sand with a sound like thunder. He tried to rise, but his body would not obey him. He lay there, conscious but helpless, staring up at the human who had defeated him. The arena was silent. Jake stood over his fallen opponent. He was not breathing hard. He had barely broken a sweat. He looked down at Dorvan with an expression that held no hatred and no pride. Then he did something that no one expected. He reached down and offered his hand. Dorvan stared at the hand. In Volanthi culture, a defeated enemy was left where they fell. Offering help was unheard of. It could be seen as mockery. "I don't understand," Dorvan said. His voice was weak, confused. "Where I come from," Jake said, "we help people up after we knock them down. Even enemies." The crowd whispered. This was not how warriors behaved. This was not how the universe worked. Dorvan reached up with one of his 4 hands and gripped Jake's arm. The human pulled with strength that surprised everyone watching. Slowly, painfully, the ambassador rose to his feet. They stood facing each other, the alien giant and the human soldier. "Why?" Dorvan asked. "You won. You could have left me in the dirt." "Because winning isn't about making someone else lose," Jake said. "It's about proving what you're capable of. I don't need to humiliate you to know what I'm worth." Saylara felt tears in her silver eyes. She had lived for 300 years, and she had never witnessed anything so simple and so profound. Dio Arvan was silent for a long moment. Then he did something that shocked the entire arena. He bowed. The ambassador of a warrior species, a creature who had never shown respect to anyone outside his own people, bowed to a human. "I was wrong about your kind," Dorvan said. "You are not weak. You are something else entirely. Something I do not have a word for." Jake nodded. "My people have a word. We call it stubborn." A laugh rippled through the crowd. Then applause began, slowly at first, then building into a roar that shook the ancient walls of the arena. Species who had dismissed humanity moments ago were now cheering for the small creature who had defeated their champion without throwing a single punch in anger. Saylara did not cheer. She simply stood on her balcony, watching the human soldier walk out of the arena with his head held high. She knew, in that moment, that everything was about to change. The universe had just discovered something it was not prepared for. It had discovered humanity, and she had discovered something else. Something personal. Something that made her heart beat faster whenever she thought of the human called Jake. She was not ready to name it yet, but she knew she would see him again. She would make certain of it. The palace of Volanthos Prime had stood for 6,000 years. Its towers reached toward the sky like fingers grasping for the stars. Its gardens held plants from 100 worlds, carefully tended by servants who had dedicated their lives to beauty. Its halls echoed with the footsteps of royalty. Jake hated it. He had been assigned to Princess Saylar's personal guard, and he understood the insult behind the honor. The council did not want him advising their generals or training their soldiers. They wanted him close enough to watch, but far enough to ignore. They wanted him to feel small and useless until he asked to go home. They did not know Jake very well. He reported for duty each morning at exactly 600 hours, Earth time. He stood at his post without complaint. He watched the halls and the gardens and the endless parade of nobles who came to seek the princess's favor. He did his job, and he did it well. Princess Saylara noticed. She had expected the human to grow bored or frustrated. She had expected him to demand a more important position or simply give up and leave. Instead, he stood at attention for 12 hours each day, his eyes always moving, his body always ready. He treated the assignment as though it were the most important mission in the galaxy. One evening, she found herself walking to his post near the garden entrance. She told herself she was simply inspecting her guard. She told herself it was nothing more than curiosity. Jake straightened when he saw her approach. "Princess, Sergeant." She stopped a few feet away, studying him with her silver eyes. "You have been here for 3 weeks. "Yes, ma'am." Most warriors would have complained by now. Most would have demanded better treatment. Jake shrugged. "A job is a job." Saylara tilted her head. "Do you not feel insulted? You defeated Dorvan in single combat. You proved your worth. And they placed you here, guarding doors." "Someone has to guard the doors," Jake said. "Might as well be someone who's good at it." She did not know what to say to that. His acceptance confused her. It was not surrender, and it was not ignorance. It was something else, something she could not quite name. "Walk with me," she said. It was not a request. They walked through the gardens as the twin moons rose over the palace. The light turned the flowers silver and gold. The air smelled of strange blossoms that had no names in any human language. "Tell me about your world," Salara said. Jake thought for a moment. "It's smaller than this one, bluer, more water than land. We have one moon instead of two, and it's close enough that we could walk on it." "You walked on your moon?" "About 400 years ago. We built ships out of metal and fire, and we threw ourselves at the sky until we got there." Salara tried to imagine it. A species so young, so fragile, so determined that they would risk everything just to touch a dead rock in the void. It seemed foolish. It seemed magnificent. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you do such a thing?" "Because it was there," Jake said. "Because someone said we couldn't. Because we wanted to know what was on the other side." They walked in silence for a while. The sounds of the palace faded behind them, and they found themselves alone among the alien flowers. "You are strange creatures," Salara said finally. "My people have lived for millennia. We have built empires and watched them fall. We have learned patience and wisdom and the value of waiting for the right moment." "Sounds peaceful," Jake said. "It is. But sometimes I wonder if we have lost something. Something your people still have." Jake stopped walking. He looked up at the twin moons, his face thoughtful in the silver light. "My grandmother used to tell me a story," he said, "about a man who was trapped in a cave. The entrance was blocked by rocks, and he had no tools, no light, no help coming. Most people would have sat down and waited to die. What did he do? He started digging with his bare hands. He dug until his fingers bled, and then he kept digging. It took him 3 days, but he got out. When they asked him how he did it, he said he just kept telling himself that the next rock would be the last one." Salara felt something shift inside her. A door opening that she had not known was closed. "You never give up," she said. "We try not to, even when it is logical to stop." Jake smiled. It was the first time she had seen him smile, and it transformed his face. The scars became marks of survival instead of damage. The weariness became depth instead of weakness. "Logic isn't everything," he said. "Sometimes the heart knows things the mind can't calculate." They stood together under the twin moons, the princess and the soldier, the ancient being and the fragile human. The distance between their species seemed smaller in the silver light. "I want to understand you," Salara said. "Your people. Your way of thinking. Will you teach me?" "I'm not a teacher," Jake said. "You taught Dorvan something he will never forget. You taught the entire council. Perhaps you are a better teacher than you realize." Jake considered this. Then he nodded slowly. "All right. But you have to teach me too. About your people, your history, why you built this place." "A fair trade," Salara agreed. They walked back toward the palace, talking quietly about small things at first. The names of flowers, the differences between human food and Volanthi cuisine, the way the stars looked from different parts of the galaxy. But the small things led to bigger things. Over the following weeks, they met often in the gardens. Salara told Jake about the ancient wars that had shaped her people, about the philosophies that guided their civilization, about the burden of living for centuries while everything around you changed. Jake told her about Earth, about the wars that had nearly destroyed humanity, and the peace that had slowly been built from the ashes, about music and art, and the strange way humans celebrated both joy and sorrow, about his family, his friends, the people he had lost, and the ones he still hoped to protect. With each conversation, the wall between their worlds grew thinner. One night, Salara asked the question that had been burning inside her since they first met. "Why do you fight? You know you will lose eventually. Time will take you even if nothing else does. Why do you struggle so hard for something you cannot keep?" Jake was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but certain. Because the struggle is the point. It's not about winning forever. It's about what you do with the time you have. Every moment of joy, every act of courage, every time you help someone who needs it. Those things matter, even if they don't last. Selara felt something break inside her. Not painfully, more like a shell cracking to let something new emerge. I have lived for 300 years, she said, and I have never understood that until now. Jake looked at her. In the moonlight, his eyes were warm and kind. Maybe that's why we need each other, he said. Your people can teach us patience. Maybe we can teach you that it's okay to fight for something, even when you know it won't last forever. Selara reached out and touched his hand. It was warm against her cool skin. It was fragile and strong at the same time. I think, she said slowly, that I am very glad you came to Volantos Prime. Jake smiled again. So am I, Princess. So am I. Above them, the twin moons continued their slow dance across the sky. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the stars, the Kreth Dominion was preparing for war. But for this moment, in this garden, there was only peace. And the beginning of something neither of them had expected to find. The sky burned red on the day the Kreth. Jake was standing at his post, near the garden entrance, when the first alarm sounded. The noise cut through the peaceful morning like a knife, sharp and urgent. He had heard alarms like this before. They meant death was coming. Within minutes, the palace became chaos. Servants ran through the halls, their faces twisted with fear. Guards rushed to defensive positions, their weapons drawn but their hands shaking. Nobles demanded answers that no one could give. Jake found Selara in the command center, surrounded by generals who were shouting at each other. Holographic displays showed the Kreth warships descending through the atmosphere, hundreds of them blotting out the sun. Ground forces were already landing in the outer districts of the city. They came too fast, one general said, his voice high with panic. Our fleet is scattered. We cannot mount a proper defense. The orbital stations are destroyed, another added. They took them out in the first wave. Selara stood in the center of the chaos, her silver eyes moving across the displays. She looked calm, but Jake could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands gripped the edge of the table. What are our options? She asked. We can evacuate, a general suggested. Take the royal family to the mountain bunkers. Wait for reinforcements. How long until reinforcements arrive? Silence. The generals looked at each other, but no one wanted to answer. 3 days, Jake said. Everyone turned to look at him. The generals wore expressions of surprise and annoyance. What did a human know about Volanthi military operations? I studied your communication protocols, Jake continued. Your nearest fleet is 3 days away at full speed. That's assuming they leave immediately. Selar nodded slowly. Can we hold for 3 days? Again, silence. The answer was clear on every face. No, they could not hold. The Kreth were too many, and the palace defenses were designed for small attacks, not full invasion. We can try, Jake said. The generals laughed. It was not a kind sound. You think you can hold against the Kreth Dominion? One of them asked. With what? Your bare hands? If I have to. Jake stepped forward, looking at the displays. His mind was already working, analyzing terrain and defensive positions, identifying choke points and fallback lines. The palace has strong walls and narrow corridors. The Kreth like open field combat where they can use their numbers. If we make them fight on our terms, we can slow them down. Slow them down? The general shook his head. You speak of delaying the inevitable. Sometimes the inevitable doesn't happen, Jake said. Sometimes you hold the line long enough for something to change. A reinforcement arrives early. The enemy makes a mistake. The universe decides to give you a break. He looked at Saylara. "But only if you're still standing when the moment comes." The room was quiet. The general stared at Jake like he had grown a second head. Saylara made her decision. "Give him a unit," she said. 20 soldiers. Let him prove what humans can do." The general started to protest, but she silenced them with a raised hand. "This is not a debate. Do it now." 1 hour later, Jake stood in a corridor on the east side of the palace. 20 Velanthi soldiers stood with him, their faces pale and uncertain. They were young, most of them. They had trained for combat, but never experienced it. Jake understood their fear. He had felt it himself many times. The trick was not to make the fear go away. The trick was to act despite it. "Listen to me," he said. "I know you're scared. I'm scared too. Anyone who isn't scared right now is either lying or stupid." The soldiers looked at him with surprise. Velanthi officers never admitted fear. "But here's the thing about fear," Jake continued. "It tells you something important is happening. It tells you that what you do right now matters. So feel the fear and then do your job anyway." He pointed down the corridor toward the outer wall. "The Kreth are going to come through that breach in about 10 minutes. They're going to expect us to run. They're going to expect us to die quickly and make their job easy." He paused. "We're not going to do that. What are we going to do?" One soldier asked. Jake smiled grimly. "We're going to make them pay for every inch of ground. We're going to hold this corridor until someone tells us to stop. And when they write the history of this battle, they're going to say that this is where the Kreth learned what real resistance looks like." The first Kreth warriors came through the breach at exactly the time Jake predicted. They were massive creatures, twice the size of humans, with dark scales and claws that could tear through metal. They expected easy prey. They found Jake instead. The battle lasted 9 hours. Jake taught his soldiers to fight in ways they had never imagined. He taught them to use the narrow corridor against the enemy, forcing the Kreth to come at them in small groups instead of overwhelming waves. He taught them to fall back in stages, making every meter cost the enemy blood. He taught them that survival was not about being stronger. It was about being smarter, faster, more determined. When soldiers fell, Jake pulled them to safety. When weapons failed, he improvised. When hope faded, he stood at the front of the line and refused to move. The Kreth pushed forward. Jake's unit pushed back. The corridor became a nightmare of smoke and noise and pain. Halfway through the battle, a Kreth blade found Jake's left arm. The pain was terrible, white-hot and blinding. He felt the bone crack, felt the muscle tear. His arm dropped to his side, useless. He kept fighting. He switched his weapon to his right hand. He adjusted his stance to compensate for the injury. He gave orders in a steady voice. Even his blood ran down his side. His soldiers watched him. They saw a creature half their size, with a broken arm and blood soaking his clothes. Still standing, still fighting, still refusing to fall. Something changed in their eyes. The fear was still there, but now there was something else. Something fierce and determined. They stopped fighting to survive. They started fighting to win. When reinforcements finally arrived, led by Princess Saylara herself, they found the corridor filled with Kreth bodies. The walls were scarred with blast marks and claw gouges. The floor was slick with blood from both sides. Jake stood at the center of it all, his weapon still raised, his eyes still alert. His armor was cracked in a dozen places. His left arm hung useless at his side. He had lost too much blood to be standing, but he was standing anyway. Saylara pushed through the soldiers toward him. She saw the wounds, the exhaustion, the absolute determination that had kept him alive when he should have died 10 times over. "Jake," she said. Her voice cracked on his name. "We held," he said. His voice was weak, but there was pride in it. "We held the line. She reached out and caught him as his legs finally gave way. He was so light in her arms, so fragile. But she understood now that fragility meant nothing. It was the spirit inside that mattered, and his spirit was made of something she had never encountered before. "You wonderful, impossible creature," she whispered. Jake smiled through the pain. "Did I teach them anything?" Solara looked at the 20 soldiers who had fought beside him. They were wounded and tired, but they stood straight, their eyes bright with something that looked almost like joy. "You taught them everything," she said. Outside the palace, the battle continued. The Kreth still came, and the defenders still fought. But something had shifted. Word spread through the Volanti forces about the human who had held the East Corridor with 20 soldiers, against impossible odds. The story gave them strength. It gave them hope. And for the first time, the Kreth began to wonder if they had underestimated their enemy. The Kreth retreated on the 4th day. The reinforcements arrived sooner than expected, their ships tearing through the atmosphere like avenging angels. The Volanti fleet had pushed their engines beyond safe limits, burning through fuel reserves that would take months to replace. When they heard what was happening on the surface, when they heard about the human who had held the East Corridor, they decided that schedules and protocols could wait. The battle turned. The Kreth, who had expected an easy conquest, found themselves facing an enemy that refused to break. They took heavy losses in the streets of the capital city. They lost 3 warships to desperate Volanti pilots who flew their damaged vessels directly into enemy formations. They lost something else too, something harder to measure. They lost their certainty. For the first time in living memory, the Kreth Dominion called a retreat. Their remaining ships gathered above Volantos Prime, hesitated for a long moment, and then jumped away into the darkness between stars. The celebration lasted for days. Jake spent most of it in a medical pod, his broken arm slowly knitting back together under the care of Volanti healers. They told him he was lucky to be alive. They told him that by all rights, he should have bled out in that corridor hours before the relief force arrived. "Humans are stubborn," he said. "We don't die when we're supposed to." The healers did not know what to make of that. Sailora visited him every day. She brought news from the council and stories from the soldiers who had fought beside him. The 20 warriors who had held the East Corridor had become heroes, their names spoken with respect throughout the Empire. They still called themselves Jake's unit, even though the battle was over. "They want to keep fighting with you," Sailora told him. "They say they learn more in 9 hours than in years of training." Jake shook his head. "I just showed them what they already had inside. The courage was theirs. You are too modest." "Maybe, but it's the truth." When Jake was finally strong enough to leave the medical center, he found a delegation waiting for him. Ambassador Dorvan stood at the front, his gray armor skin polished until it gleamed. Behind him were representatives from a dozen species, including several who had laughed at humanity just weeks before. "The council requests your presence," Dorvan said. His voice was different now, softer and more respectful. "There is a matter to be discussed." The council chamber was packed. Every floating platform was occupied. Every seat was filled. The crystal pillars glowed with warm golden light instead of the cold blue Jake remembered from his first visit. Princess Salara stood on the central platform, dressed in ceremonial robes that shimmered like liquid silver. Her crown was a delicate thing made of light and crystal, resting on her pale hair like a captured star. She was the most beautiful thing Jake had ever seen. "Sergeant J. Callahan," she announced, her voice carrying through the chamber. "Step forward." Jake walked to the center of the room. He still moved carefully, favoring his healing arm. But his back was straight, and his eyes were clear. "You came to us as a representative of your people," Salara continued. "You were dismissed and mocked by those who should have known better. You were given a meaningless assignment and expected to fail." The chamber was silent. Many of the diplomats who had mocked Jake were present, their faces carefully neutral. Instead, you taught us something we had forgotten. You showed us that strength is not measured in size or lifespan or the hardness of skin. You showed us that true strength comes from the refusal to surrender, even when surrender is the logical choice. She paused, letting her words settle over the assembly. You held a corridor with 20 soldiers against an army that should have crushed you. You gave our people hope when hope seemed impossible. You bled for a world that was not your own, simply because it was the right thing to do. Jake felt something warm spreading through his chest. He had not expected recognition. He had not expected anything except the chance to do his job, and maybe, if he was lucky, make it home alive. The Council has made a decision, Salara said. Humanity has proven its worth beyond any doubt. We offer them full partnership in the Volanthi Alliance, with all the rights and responsibilities that entails. Your ships will fly beside ours. Your soldiers will train with ours. Your world will be protected as our own. A murmur ran through the chamber. This was more than anyone had expected. Humanity, the young species with soft skin and short lives, was being raised to equal status with civilizations that had existed for thousands of years. Do you accept this offer on behalf of your people? Salara asked. Jake looked up at her. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the chamber faded away. There was only the two of them, the princess and the soldier, standing on the edge of something neither of them had ever imagined. I accept, Jake said. On behalf of Earth and all her children. The chamber erupted in applause. Diplomats who had laughed at humanity stood and cheered. Warriors who had dismissed humans as weaklings pounded their fists in celebration. Something fundamental had shifted in the galaxy, and everyone present knew it. But Jake was not looking at the crowd. He was looking at Salara, who was walking down from her platform with tears shining in her silver eyes. She stopped in front of him, close enough to touch. You changed everything, she said softly. Not just for your people. For all of us. I just did what any human would do, Jake said. We don't give up. Not on our friends, not on each other, not on anything that matters. Salara reached out and took his hand. Her skin was cool against his warmth, her fingers long and elegant around his scarred knuckles. I have lived for 300 years, she said. I have seen empires rise and fall, watched stars born and die. I thought I understood the universe. She squeezed his hand. I was wrong. You taught me that I still have so much to learn. Jake smiled. Then we can learn together. Is that a promise? It's more than a promise. Where I come from, we call it hope. The celebration continued around them, but they stood still at the center of it all. Two people from different worlds who had found something unexpected in each other. The future was uncertain. The Kreth would return eventually, stronger and angrier than before. Other threats waited in the darkness between stars. But for the first time in a long time, those threats did not seem so frightening. Humanity had joined the galactic community not as servants or subordinates, but as equals. They had proven that small and fragile did not mean weak. They had shown that the size of a warrior's heart mattered more than the length of their life. And somewhere in the vast emptiness of space, word was spreading. The stories traveled from ship to ship, from world to world, from species to species. Stories about a young race that refused to quit. Stories about a soldier who held a line he should never have been able to hold. Stories about the strange and wonderful creatures called humans. The galaxy had underestimated them once, thought it would not make that mistake again. Jake stood in the council chamber with Salara's hand in his, and he thought about everything that had brought him here. The battles and the losses. The friends who had died and the enemies who had become allies. The long journey from a small blue planet to the heart of an alien empire thought it had been worth it. All of it, because in the end, That was what humans did. They struggled and suffered, and sometimes they fell. But they always got back up. They always kept reaching for something better. And sometimes, if they were very lucky, they found it.